So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our breakfast keynote speaker. I'm very fortunate, je suis très ravi de pouvoir accueillir Jim O'Sullivan, maintenant à la retraite, mais qui a travaillé comme secrétaire à la commission. Now, Jim will correct me, I think at the ripe old age of 27, and with a lot of experience under his belt because he had just been secretary of the Deutsch Commission on Post-Secondary Education that had wrapped up, and at 27 years of age, gets to be the secretary to the commission, gets to hear everyone, gets to hear all the chatter and all the discussions and all the debates and all the issues, and gets to put all those great ideas down on paper. Jim was most recently a vice president of finance at the University of New Brunswick, and so it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Jim O'Sullivan.
I'm a lot riper now. I'm glad you didn't introduce me as a ghost from commission past. It's hard to imagine that some things like the Byrne Commission and the Program of Equal Opportunity could happen in New Brunswick today. Even more surprising is that they happened at all. New Brunswick was a much different place 50 years ago, although I think you'll find that some of the themes from those days still resonate with us today. When they thought of it at all, many New Brunswickers saw the New Brunswick many Canadians saw the New Brunswick of the 1960s as something of a backwater, maybe a kind of Louisiana North without the jazz. In his 1961 book, Politics in New Brunswick, Professor Hugh Thorburn of Queen's University argued that because the province did not offer attractive opportunities to educated and vigorous young men without moneyed connections, many left the province to find jobs elsewhere. According to Thorburn, those who kick against the pricks are encouraged to leave. Those who accommodate themselves to things as they are remain. Perhaps such conditions, he said, existing over a prolonged period, account for much of New Brunswick's charm, its strong local loyalties, and its calm and resigned acceptance of things. In 1960, there was no UNB in St. John, and there were only about 2,000 students on this campus, and half of them came from outside the province. The creation of the French language University de Moncton was still in the future. There was no such thing as an Official Languages Act. It would be another decade before the provincial government would have its first woman cabinet minister. Before 1960, there was no Irving oil refinery in St. John, and the McCains had only begun to sell French fries. Although bootleggers could easily be found, you couldn't get a drink in a restaurant in New Brunswick in 1960. There was no national Medicare, no Canada pension plan. Unemployment insurance had only recently been extended to seasonal workers and not yet to fishermen. The big expansion in benefits, including maternity leave, would not come for another decade. People in New Brunswick were not encouraged to rock the boat. The major newspapers in New Brunswick, according to Thorburn, took what was called a studied nonpartisan role at election time. The result, he said, has been an amazing dearth of political commentary in the press of the province. At the height of the election campaign, the editorials are devoted to such worthy causes as safe driving and forest fire prevention. The major papers do not even print letters to the editor. Certainly, if elections are becoming increasingly dull, the press is partly responsible for that change. Thorburn could hardly say that today. This is a time for personal disclosure. During the early 1950s, I worked as a sports reporter for the Telegraph Journal, and as part of my job, I covered the harness races at Exhibition Park in St. John and at Gagetown. I was able to write about the horses and about the drivers, but as my contribution to journalistic rectitude, I was not allowed to mention that betting took place. New Brunswick had no dominating urban center. Most of the population was scattered around small communities along river valleys and the seashore, or huddled in a few small cities and towns at river mouths and other strategic locations. The two large language and cultural groups, the Loyalist English and the Acadian French, lived mainly in separate parts of the province, and there were not many exchanges between them. Both the Loyalists and the Acadians had long histories that created deep feelings of insecurity. In the mid-1750s, the Acadians had been expelled by the British from a region where they lived for more than a century. And those who came back to live in New Brunswick were anxious for quiet accommodation, not for new confrontation. Not 30 years later, in 1783, the Loyalists who came to the province had been on the losing side of the American Revolution, stripped of their standing and possessions, and exiled to what they thought was a strange wilderness where making their new life would not be easy. And of course, there was a third force, the Irish, who fled the famine at home to settle in the Miramichi and St. John in the 19th century, and who, according to Yeats, were bound to bring with them an abiding sense of tragedy to sustain them through any temporary periods of joy. In later decades, New Brunswick did not lack new reasons for grievance and frustration. The goal of achieving a new prosperity through the Canadian Federation of 1867 was elusive. The new waves of immigrants from Europe bypassed the maritime provinces to settle further west. Many people born in New Brunswick headed west or to the United States in search for greater opportunity. Unemployment among those who remained in New Brunswick was persistently higher than in the rest of Canada, and earned incomes were significantly lower. Indeed, the province was becoming a smaller and smaller part of the wider Canadian economy and national political life. Despite its small population, New Brunswick in 1960 was totally blanketed by local government structures, each seeking to better its own situation. The Byrne Commission found that there were no fewer than 547 local taxing and tax-supported authorities. There were 6 cities and 21 towns, 15 county councils, and 470 local school authorities. As a share of personal income, total and local government taxation in New Brunswick was the 3rd highest in Canada, behind only Quebec and Saskatchewan, and higher than in every one of the United States except Vermont. And despite the already high level, total taxes in New Brunswick are rising more rapidly than the national average in both Canada and the United States. Within this New Brunswick, there are great disparities in local tax burdens and in the quality of public services. This was especially so for education, and particularly for French-speaking students whose numbers were growing rapidly. New Brunswick's overall spending per pupil was the 2nd lowest in Canada, yet inside the province, schools in one county could spend 2.5 times more dollars per student than schools in another county. Some of the rural government units were close to financial collapse. There had been a number of inquiries into government affairs, but the main effect had been to patch over problems with no fundamental change. Pressures for change were growing, though. The spread of automobiles and paved roads, I really am old, air travel, movies, radio, and now television all sparked new awareness and ambition. The Salk vaccine and the launching of Sputnik emphasized the potentials for science and technology and underscored the need for quality education and skill training. In 1960, and to the surprise of many, the province elected a new Liberal government under a young Acadian premier, Louis Robichaud, and shortly thereafter, Ed Byrne was approached to accept the chair of a commission to examine finance and municipal taxation in the province. Ed did not agree immediately. He said yes only after negotiating successfully to get the sweeping terms of reference he wanted. He also made sure to get the kind of technical assistance he wanted. 3 acknowledged experts from out of town: Milton Moore and Philip White from the University of British Columbia, and John Graham from Dalhousie University. Byrne then worked hard with these consultants over a period of 20 months to assess the basic issues and to develop the main thrust of the report. And all of this took place before the other 4 members of the commission were appointed in 1962. These other commission members were Arthur Andrews of St. Stephen, Alexandre Boudreau of St. Joseph's University, a predecessor of the University de Moncton, Ulrich Nadeau of Baker Brook, and Charles Wilson of St. John. The commissioners and consultants were assisted by a small but very effective office and secretarial staff. I had to say that. I became the secretary in 1962, after most of these arrangements were already in place. I arrived just in time for the mad rush to the finish line. This involved meetings with various provincial government ministers and officials, extensive research and fact-finding projects, 20 days of public hearings around the province, and seemingly endless drafting of sections of the report. In the end, and after much internal debate and a marathon lockup session, the 5 commissioners agreed unanimously with the report and the recommendations. 1,000 pages in mimeographed format. At the tender age of 27, I'd never seen anything like it. Who was this fellow Byrne? And I think it's worthwhile saying a few words about him. Ed was a small-town lawyer with big clients and some big ideas and an entrepreneurial flair. He was born in New Brunswick in 1912, in Chatham, part of Miramichi now, but grew up and went to school in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. His home life was not happy. His father was a doctor with a big drinking problem, and his parents fought often and bitterly. Not surprisingly, Ed soon became an independent thinker and a strong-willed personality. He did start to study medicine, graduating in science from St. Avex and enrolling in the Dalhousie Medical School, but he hated medicine and quit in his second year. Ed really wanted to study law, and after a big fight at home, he struck out on his own. He helped pay his way to law school by operating slot machines, one-armed bandits. After a year, he had more than 6 dozen spread over half of Nova Scotia. And when he heard they might be outlawed, he sold out to a competing operator at a profit. Ed loved the law, but this was the Depression, and there were few jobs for lawyers when he graduated from law school in 1937. So Ed took a train across Canada all the way to Vancouver, stopping at the major centers along the way in search for a job with an established and respected law firm. Along the way, he also supported himself with a series of odd jobs. Nevertheless, he had no luck getting the position with a law firm, and he decided to take the train back to Halifax. For some reason, he got off in Bathurst, and after a few days, he decided to set up his law office there. Things were slow for a while, but he nailed a few important clients like Sir James Dunn and the Bathurst Power and Paper Company. Before long, he was representing 3 large paper mills and a good many other forest and fishing companies. He served on the local school board and 2 terms as mayor of the town. Perhaps just as important, he made a good deal of money from shrewd investments in the mining business in Bathurst in the 1950s. Ed's idea about the commission was that it should aim to cure, not tinker. Rather than accepting existing forms of government structure, the commission proposed a complete reorganization of local and school government, and consequently of the provincial government. General services, services to people, education, health, welfare, and justice were to be administered by provincial agencies and financed completely by the provincial treasury. The compartments should be watertight. For example, any proposal to supplement the provincial education program would have to be financed by the taxpayers of that district and implemented only after approval by 90% of the resident property taxpayers voting in a plebiscite. The aim was to achieve equalization of service quality and financial burden through centralized responsibility at the provincial level. Local services for property and person would continue to be determined by local option. These local services, such as police and fire protection, local works and sanitation, community services and recreation, would be financed by taxation of real property within the area served, but with a rational grant system based on population, tax base, and mean cost of services to reward the efficient and discourage the inefficient. Stripped of their responsibilities, the 15 county governments, which were a large part of New Brunswick history, were to disappear, and arrangements made to provide local services to the residents living outside cities, towns, and villages when and where they wanted them. The Byrne Commission did not support the forced amalgamations of adjacent communities, but they did recommend that in these cases there be mandatory unified delivery of 5 services: water, fire and police protection, sanitary sewage disposal, and community planning. While the offering of other services would be left to local choice, the options would be limited. Municipalities were to be restricted to a specific list of activities. There would be no residual or catch-all power, and there would be ceilings on the taxation and borrowing authority they had. In Byrne's view, municipalities must operate within the revenue they derived from their own non-tax revenue, including provincial government grants, plus a limited tax on real property. Operation of the new local government structure would be supervised by a provincial affairs office. To provide professional integrity for the determination of property values for real property taxation, there would be a provincial office with the required expertise. In his 1961 book, Thorburn had concluded that the main aim of both New Brunswick political parties was, and I quote, to defend the status quo and impede change. As the parties are concerned to draw support from all areas of the province, they are careful to appeal to all. This leads them to emphasize local representation. Local representatives naturally seek to further the interests of their constituents. Efforts are thinly spread among many competing interests, and the party system is a conservative force defending the prevailing state of affairs and working against drastic innovation. The Byrne Commission aimed to escape from this past because it said the past has failed us by creating a new kind of administrative commission to operate the general services and supervise local government